Okay, so, well, due to increasing pressure from these anti-Japanese nativist movement that I just alluded to in the last video towards the end, for example, you see white patriotic leagues, so to say, such as the Asiatic Exclusion League. And by the way, here's a flyer for a meeting, a public meeting, whereby the topic of the meeting was Asiatics must not be naturalized and no Japanese in our schools. All right, so these efforts by these nativists were ramped up to stem the immigration flow of Japanese while preventing them from gaining or achieving permanent settlement. And let me remind you that, the Japanese, unlike a lot of the Chinese earlier, they desire to own land. And if you want to own land, and you actually do own land, well, that means permanent residence in the United States rather than sojourning, right? So they want to prevent those two things, stop the immigration flow, and then for those who are already on American soil, they want to prevent them from permanent settlement. So there's two ways that were really undertaken to try to accomplish these goals. The first one is the Gentlemen's Agreement Act of 1907, and the second one will be the Alien Land Acts. I should have made that plural because there are several land acts, and they're state acts, okay, state laws, so various states will pass this in the West. Okay, so for the first one, the Gentlemen's Agreement Act, well, I did mention earlier, and I emphasize this, that unlike China, Japan was a formidable power by the turn of the 20th century. In fact, it was gaining respect from much of the Western world. And, they made efforts to protect their citizens abroad, but they didn't always succeed. And you could say this was the case with the Japanese in the United States. And you'll see this, surrounding the circumstances leading to the Gentlemen's Agreement Act of 1907. So what led to this Gentlemen's Agreement Act? Well, even 2 years before 1907, you see a new city law in San Francisco demanding that Japanese and Korean school children not to be integrated in the public schools. In fact, it says so here, right? 1906 is this one, but it began in 1905. It was really enforceable. These laws that were passed were enforceable after the earthquake of 1906 that was aforementioned in this lecture. With the schools and other infrastructure damaged, San Francisco was able to put the law in motion finally. It was the perfect circumstance to do this. And it was particularly the Japanese who greatly resented this particular law that tried to prevent integration in public schooling. Why? Because they considered the so-called alternatives to the Japanese, which they called Oriental schools. They considered the quote Oriental schools to be inferior to those that taught whites. So you see the news of Japanese segregation actually reaching Japan, and the Japanese government considered it indeed as an insult to its national honor, to the citizens abroad, and they demanded that segregation practices be nullified, basically. So this grew into an international incident, and you even had President Theodore Roosevelt, the president at that time, being forced to intercede in this affair. Now, the president, Roosevelt, actually held Japan in high regard. He respected them, though he did feel that persons of color were inferior naturally. Okay, he was a racist, but he did respect Japan, and he didn't want to insult Japan, in other words. Yet at the same time, he received a lot of pressure from these California nativists. And, Roosevelt would discover basically that indeed the real issue is not education per se, but immigration. Okay, the nativists wanted to stem immigration. That's the core of their activism and their agitation. So the resolution of this conflict, and it's known as the Gentlemen's Agreement Act, it basically reflects this dilemma faced by Roosevelt. While Roosevelt promised that the segregation practices would be abolished and that, the present Japanese immigrants would be accepted, and family unification be allowed, he also forced the Japanese government to quit sponsoring immigration passports to the new laborers into the continental U.S. And moreover, Roosevelt demanded that re-migration of the Japanese from Hawaii to the mainland that I referred to earlier be terminated as well. Okay, and at the same time, the Japanese government did not wish to face the same circumstances as China did, with the 1882 Exclusion Act and so forth. So they acquiesced to this demand in order to save face. Therefore, the Gentleman's Agreement Act, and notice the term Gentleman's Agreement, right? It's as if it's a agreement, a pact made between two gentlemen, right? Respectable parties involved. It marks the end of the labor flow of Japanese migrant workers to the continental U.S. All right. So, again, this won't be lifted until after World War II. Okay. Now, after the Gentleman's Agreement Act, you see the state of California begin to consider passing laws preventing the Japanese from owning land, because that's what a lot of Japanese were trying to do. So when you think about this prohibition of land ownership, being that the Japanese were agricultural, right? That's what they're doing. They first migrated under the auspices of agribusiness, and then many of them pursued their own land. So they're agricultural at core. And when you think about this, you're denying them land ownership in the United States. So it's a calculated effort to strike at the heart of Japanese survival and even success, since, as I just emphasized, most Japanese laborers were so successful that they're able not only to lease land as tenant farmers, but also to own it. Therefore, you see in 1913 in California, the first Alien Land Act passed, which prohibited land ownership by, quote, aliens ineligible for citizenship, unquote. Now, we know where that term comes from. It comes from the 1882 Exclusion Act, which basically lumps all Asians together as aliens, and they're barred from citizenship, right, just by virtue of being Asian. And another thing that was added to the Alien Land Act is that it set the lease period, if they happen to be leasing a land, it set the lease period for aliens at only 3 years. Okay, so this, as you can see, is going to make Japanese survival, let alone prosperity, it's going to leave it hanging in the balance. But this law, by the way, was passed in 1913, and we entered World War I in 1914. So because of the preoccupation of the nation with the war, and also the need for Japanese laborers in the West during the war, because they needed to count on agribusiness producing the crops, right? This was a wartime emergency, so they couldn't stall, the food supply. So here's a case, again, when the Japanese were needed, even though they're not wanted. Okay, so what I'm saying here is the 1913 law was not strenuously enforced because of the war. And by the way, there are loopholes in this 1913 law. For example, it didn't say anything about American-born Japanese children, Nisei. And let's remember that they can now become citizens, right, because of the Wong Kim Ark case. So a lot of the Issei, in other words, just basically titled their American-born children with ownership. So this is a way of escaping, right, a loophole from the first Alien Land Act. But sure enough, after the war, you see the efforts being reinstated to strengthen the original law, actually. So by 1920, you see amendments added to the original act. And it basically ended the ability of the Asian aliens to lease farm land altogether. so you can't lease any longer. It prohibited them from purchasing land in the name of their American-born children, so that loophole was now gone. Okay, so you see California passing this Alien Land Act, and from there it is passed by other states like Arizona, New Mexico, Washington, Montana, Oregon. They passed their own versions of the Alien Land Act. Now, notice the term here is alien, but it's specifically directed towards Japanese aliens. Okay, just like the term gentleman's agreement, it doesn't specifically say Japanese agreement or Japanese Land Act. Okay, why? Again, because negotiation with Japan, and this is so different with the Chinese, where they expressly stated the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Here you have this couched in the language of, again, two gentlemen, right, coming to an agreement, or the Alien Land Act sounding more generic, right, applying to all aliens when in fact it didn't. Okay, so for the Japanese in California and other states that passed it, this was a matter of life or death to them, since farming was their bread and butter in America. Now they're denied land ownership and even land leasing. Okay, so you could argue, and I think it's a correct argument, that the 1920 Alien Land Act, with the amendments aimed to destroy the economic foundations of Japanese immigrant society itself, then what's happening is you're basically reducing the Japanese again to migratory farm laborers. Okay, so the corollary of this is that they're preventing permanent settlement of the Japanese, because they're now back on that radically migratory, seasonal farming, like I talked about. No longer are they allowed to stay stationary with, land as their possession. Okay, so this would be the fate that befell a lot of the Japanese, most of the Japanese in the West. Now, what we're going to see a few decades after all this is the outbreak of World War II, after Pearl Harbor. And we're going to be talking about how both the Issei and the Nisei, but 2/3 of those who are going to be sent to concentration camps are going to be American citizens, the Nisei. And we'll broach that topic in a few weeks.